Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Gun by the band The Gun.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
But before we start off this video, I'm gonna elaborate about what I'm gonna say a bit more tomorrow, but for now, know that I've taken off 10 albums from the list, and that means that there's 10 empty spaces on the list currently that have to be filled with albums from the reserved list. So what I've done is I've put a link in the description of this video, so please, anyone who's watching this video, go ahead, go into the link. It's a Google form, just fill out the albums that you want to see in this year's series, and then I'll put them on there. But anyway, here's some of my favorite bits from this album. So 1967 might be the first landmark year when talking about progressive rock. You see, I know that 1969 is usually regarded as the year when prog began as a thing within the court of the Crimson King, but when it comes down to talking about prog, we have to address 1967, which is a year that comes time and time again in prog literature, and mostly for the reason that a lot of the big prog bands, or a lot of the first prog bands, have formed in that year. So probably the biggest example of it all is, of course, Pink Floyd. They formed in that year officially, and they released their first album in that year, but we also have bands like Jethro Tull or Family or Comus, which we reviewed a few days ago, and we also have the band we're talking about today, which is of course The Gun. Now, The Gun might be the first actual power trio we've seen in a progressive rock band ever. These guys were influenced by artists like Jimi Hendrix, and they've made a lot in being the pioneers of the hard rock style and the hard prog style, and the sound that they featured on this album of theirs would be later on refined by a band like Led Zeppelin. And when forming this band, at one point a singer called John Anderson joined them, but John Anderson would not want to stay with them and he joined a lesser known band called Yes. And these guys were actually on the road to success. They were well known at the UFO Club in London, and they opened for bands like Tomorrow and even Pink Floyd themselves. But unfortunately, it seems like the journey for The Gun would end quite abruptly in 1969 after they released their first album, which is the one we're reviewing today, in 1968, their second album called Gunsight in 1969, and then they kind of disbanded, but technically they just reformed as another group with a different musical interest. But as for their influence on the progressive scene, as I know this and as I've heard, these guys have given us two amazing Proto Prog albums that would go on to define the genre later on. Now, of course, I'm only saying this about their first album. The second one I've just seen is very highly regarded by many, so I can only assume it is pretty seminal by itself. Now, for anyone who's not too familiar with Proto Prog, I will let you all know this in advance. I review Proto Prog in a different way than how I review regular prog music, and the reason for it is, despite how you might want to look at it in one way or another, almost all of the progressive bands from 1969 and onwards were to some extent influenced by other bands. Now, that is to say, Proto Prog bands were not entirely self-made, and of course they all had influences, but none of these influences were prog influences. They were jazz influences, blues, rock, classical, but when being influenced in the Proto Prog area, bands used to take their influence from a wide array of genres in music rather than bands bands like Nowadays or even back in the 70s, which took a lot of inspiration from what their peers were doing in the progressive scene. And of course from 1969 onwards, the ever-increasing arsenal of progressive musical ideas have just grown to expand, and we've seen a lot of bands that were original with their sound and a lot of copycats. And if you're interested in any of these copycat bands, you can always check out yesterday's episode. But the thing I really liked about this debut album by The Gun is seeing how they were innovative enough to actually take a bunch of different musical ideas and try and develop something new out of them. And you can actually call these guys prog, despite a lot of this album not being entirely progressive. But again, as I said, we can't really judge this album in the same way we do for later on progressive albums. And with that, I look at a Proto Prog subgenre as some sort of a sacred subgenre, which I can only review to some extent without actually getting in the way of criticizing what is basically impossible, or what was impossible for these bands at the time. Because let's face it, what The Gun were doing is trial and hopefully not error, and I think that they got a lot of things right, but they also got some things wrong. Now, I wouldn't say that this album is the quintessential Proto Prog album. I believe that there were bands that made the genre more defined even before it was actually defined as prog, like Touch or Frank Zappa's work, but I do believe that The Gun had a lot of influence, especially in the realm of hard prog. And you can clearly see that right from the get-go with this album, with the first track called The Race with the Devil. It's a really interesting track. It's something that I kind of would have expected to find on Led Zeppelin's first few albums. It's really cool and it's groundbreaking in my opinion, and I believe that people that heard it back in the day were definitely awed by what it had to offer. But then we get to the second track, which really goes and narrows down on the essence of what prog sometimes is, which is of course a song titled The Sad Saga of the Boy and the Bee, which is by itself a very obscure name, and this one tells a quirky little story, much like a lot of the great shorter progressive rock songs know how to do so well. And then unfortunately, when we get into the midst of this album, we see that the band are kind of struggling with not repeating stuff and ideas and actually making something new. They're trying their best. I personally don't remember a lot from the midsection of this album, but it does actually get better with the last two tracks, the first of them being my personal favorite from this album, called Rat Race. To me at least, this particular song feels like some sort of an epiphany by the band. It seems like what they've been doing so far is going by the process of trial and error, trying things, succeeding or failing, and suddenly this song comes along, and in my personal opinion, it really is a fantastic song, an almost perfect song in my opinion, and I really loved it. Everything from the way the instruments are being played and the instruments that are chosen to be featured on this one, and the lyrics and the singing and the fluidity of the song, which is pretty basically structured but at the same time is pretty fluid. It all comes down to what I really like about Proto Prog, and that's the things that actually stick, like this song. But I can wholeheartedly understand why someone would rate the next and last song on this album as their favorite from this one. I am of course talking about the song called Take Off. Well, I should have kind of said it as take off because it's not like you're taking off your socks, it's a takeoff of a rocket, and the way that I know it is because this song literally opens up with a countdown, and of course that the countdown is multilingual because why not, so they count in various different languages and it's pretty cool. And then we just, lift off and we're presented with this really lovely track, which is technically pretty basically structured. You have the first verse and you have the chorus, but then you have a big improvisation part which features most of this song's runtime, when at the end it comes back to another verse, another chorus, and then it ends. And I'll just let you all know that the improvisation piece in the middle that is led mostly by the drums is absolutely beautiful. It's really great to listen to, and I'm so happy that I've stuck through this entire album to get to this point because it was really worth the wait. But if there's one thing that I really love about this song is the symbolism behind it. So I said that Rat Race was basically some sort of an epiphany when they realized what they were doing and which direction they wanted to go in, and this song is the actualization of that understanding. They went from what is known from the ground to what's stable, and into the realm of the unknown. They've taken off into space, into the place where everything is possible, and you can even look at that as sort of a space rock metaphor. I really like it. I really like how this album ends, and honestly it has put a grin on my face to listen to this last piece. So yeah, if what I've just described to you sounds interesting to you and you're looking to get into some interesting Proto Prog albums, I highly advise you to go ahead and check this one. Does it justify the rating of 4.7 out of 5 stars that it has on the Prog archives? No, it doesn't. I really don't know how does it have this high of a rating. Like, it has enough ratings to be somewhat, concise, but this album is like a fan favorite in so many regards, and I don't know why that is, but it's a pretty great album, and I would recommend it to most of the people watching this video who especially don't know this album. This album cover might be a big part of why progressive rock music didn't develop in 1968 instead of 1969. Maybe nowadays it doesn't look like a lot seeing a cover with demonic figures with the title Gun on it, but back in the 60s people were much more conservative, and stuff like these, well, they weren't looked at with a welcoming eye, and I can only assume that parents didn't really rush to get this album as a Christmas present for their teenagers. But to me at least, this album cover is pretty interesting and it's very unique and intriguing, and I really like looking at it and the way that it's made. I love the imagery on it. I love the demon spawns that are found on it. They look very pleased with their very gruesome occupation, and that's all pretty nice and all, and somehow it even kind of connects to me with the music, despite this not being a heavy metal album that talks about demons and stuff and things like that. It actually kind of connects with the Proto Prog hard rock vibe that this one gives off, and I really like that. So I can only assume that this album was some sort of a counterculture album that maybe back in the day wasn't really something you'd expect to listen to mainstreamly, but nowadays in the test of time, this album is one that deserves a high regard. So this album had a few 9 out of 10 songs and some 7s and some 8s, so I think it's gonna get the average of them all, and I'll give it a rating of 8 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Cotton Candy by Shlomo Gronich. I of course want to thank my lovely supporter over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Walnamy. You are the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.